Hello, good evening. Um, Welcome to what has really weirdly been the most challenging module for me to put together uh over these last weeks. Um, and the title of this module is Who Gets to Learn? Now, before diving into the module itself, uh, as ever, a little bit of housekeeping. Um, First of all, if you are here simply just to comment on my appearance, no, you're not. That's not what we're here for. We're here to learn from each other. Um, so it's been a bit of a time. I know what I look like. You know what I look like. We don't need to talk about it. Uh, Before we really jump into kind of the meat of this week, um, there is a Substack that I want to give a shout out to, and that I will have more information about them like in the description for this lecture after it goes live. Um, but the Substack is Literary Liberation, and it's run by honestly probably my most like long time internet friend, Shauna Ayub, um, who is literally the best. But they are doing um, a national food drive to help those who are impacted by SNAP. Or rather, these days get to be long, don't they? Um, those impacted by the cutting off of SNAP benefits here in the United States. So if you're in a position to help, um, please check out Literary Liberation. They really are doing incredible work, both to help people with food security, and also just to get us like reading and writing in a way that is healing for us. Um, so we're talking this week about um, really who is it that gets to learn? And it's such a simple question. You really would assume that it has a simple answer, wouldn't you? Uh, and sadly, we are living in a time and a space where that is not. I don't want to say that that's not necessarily the case, right? Because everybody has access to learn. I think it would probably be more accurate to say who has access to education and knowledge that kind of carries some social weight to it, right? Um, and that really is the question that we're talking about when we're talking about education. So I really, from the outset, wanted to start us out with um, actually a declaration from the United Nations. Because, of course, obviously, education and like knowledge acquisition was around well before the United Nations was founded. Um, oh, excuse me. But when the United Nations was founded and they drafted their Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the core tenets, um, which is in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, comes out really strongly to say that education is a right. And that, and I quote, education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages, for the strengthening respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. End quote. So, at one point, lost connection there for a second, the global community did agree that education is a right. Um, And yet, not that long ago, at least I'm going to pretend, excuse me, like it's not that long ago, in 2009, when my then friend, Nathan, uh, was photographed for the front cover of a local community college magazine in the community that we live in. And he wore a T-shirt that said, "Education is a right." And that was the slogan for the United States Student Association, um, which is less robust now than it was when Nathan and I were young adults. Uh, People got really upset that the community college ran a photo of a student wearing that T-shirt as a message. And they in fact got quite a few letters objecting to that sentiment. Um, and so I think that we really need to think about how we are contextualizing education here, right? Um, because at least in the United States, at the elementary and secondary levels, education is primarily funded through taxpayer dollars, which my own opinion is that that's completely appropriate. Like that is an absolutely wonderful and acceptable use of tax funds. But there are a lot of people who don't agree with that take. So I am puzzled why that's a controversial take. However, it is one. And I think it's really like this concept, right? That education is a right. Uh, and I would go then a little further to say that public education is a right, is really important for us to understand, right? As public education, which can, of course, can and should be reimagined. My desk is falling apart. Um, Not really, by the way. But right, can and should be reimagined, but should be reimagined as the key to unlocking a world where social equity is uh, kind of the thing that we are striving for. Which then brings us to talking a little bit more about education in the developing world. Um, I think that this is more about me than about anything else. I personally really struggle with the idea that access to education is simply for economic development. Um, I think that there's something extremely powerful about seeking knowledge and engaging in knowledge creation simply for its own sake. However, the data behind education as an economic investment is absolutely undeniable. Because access to formal education improves the economic outcomes both of individuals and countries dramatically. Now, in this module, I used Guatemala as an example of how education can improve economic outcomes. Now, not that long after Nathan was blasted for wearing that shirt in our local community college magazine, Steph Mom Never Told You hosts Molly and Kristen did an episode talking about the importance of educating girls in Guatemala. Now, as an aside, I have been a years long fan of Stuff Mom Never Told You. They've gone through a lot of hosts. So, Molly and Kristen are not the hosts now, but they were in 2010 when this episode came out. Now, one thing that they talk about in that episode, and again, I quote, females who will complete a secondary education will earn 50% more than they would with no education, compared to males who complete secondary education would earn 27% more than they would. So when we're looking at access to education, we're also talking about um, kind of a gender divide, right, between who has access and who does not. Um, Now, one thing that Molly and Kristen talk about in their episode that has been talked about in other spaces as well is really the social conversation about who it is in the community that deserves access to a formal education. And broadly, it's accepted that boys and men would be the ones to to go to school because they're the ones that are earning the living for the family. Um, well, of course, that on some level may be true. However, uh, women have the right to economic self-determination, and access to schooling gives them that. And to assume that the men are always going to be available is generally not a great assumption, right? Um, there's all kinds of things that can take men clean out of the picture, and the family still needs to be provided for, right? Um, but I also think that that notion, and we kind of talked about this a few weeks ago as well, really cheapens the incredible amount of labor that goes into running a home. Now, do you necessarily need to go to school for that? Well, no. Um, but it is helpful. It's helpful. Any experience really that is going to help you to broaden your worldview is going to help you with creative problem solving. And anybody who is responsible for home management knows that diverse perspectives and creative problem solving are kind of like right up there in skills that you need to just keep things running day to day. Kind of going back to that wage piece that Molly and Kristen talked about, um, we can assume, right, that there's that big difference between what men and women would earn if they had access to schooling. Uh, is also the result of the closing wage inequality gap, which here in this class we believe is true. And it is also linked in the module. So if you want to read more about wage inequality from a reputable source, you absolutely can. Excuse me. But regardless, I think that we can all agree that access to schooling is critically important for us to be able to kind of have that economic self-determination that I mentioned just a few seconds ago. Um, Now this last piece of of the module here, I really want us to spend some time thinking about the future of education as a human right. Because of course we are living through a moment where education is both more accessible, like this class as an example, than it ever has been before. But it's also more fragile. Right? Like, I'm not naive. I know that there is so much information out there that um, what I am doing and what we're doing here together is really barely cutting through the noise of the incredible amount of content that is out there in the world. And so when I'm thinking about fragility, I'm really thinking about the fragility of um, really how we think about and conceptualize learning, right? Um, and I say this I'm really hesitating here because I don't necessarily want to speak off the cuff in a way that is disingenuous. When you have access to a diversity of thought, right? And whether that is through formal education or through, right, um, like self-determined education, right, that you are pursuing on your own. I don't think that we should broadly ever live in a world where everybody is going to agree about 100% of things, right? Because our lived experience is always going to be different. Where the fragility in that system really does come in my opinion, is the inability that some of us have to really think through like thoughts and arguments and ideas and come to any kind of consensus. Right now, at the beginning of this, 20 minutes ago, I talked about the loss of SNAP benefits. Um, and right, if you've been paying any kind of attention to uh, the news, like the news media, you know that there are 42 million people in the United States that are currently going into their first week of not having access to adequate food. And I think that having access to high quality education and a diversity of thought would lead most people to say that it is unacceptable for 42 million people to be hungry. Um, and unfortunately, within the United States, that access has not been as present, I think, as we would like for it to be. As, from a lot of us would like for it to be. Excuse me. And so when I think about fragility, I think about kind of the breakdown in social safety, right? That our system is fragile and 42 million people are hungry because we can't come to a consensus that people deserve food, right? Um, so all of that to say, when I'm thinking about the fragility of our education system, it's those kinds of things that I really am thinking about. Um, but so we really need to kind of take the opportunity here, right, to get serious about how we're coming together on these topics. Um, Now, in her TED Talk, How to Get Serious About the Future of Education, um, Amal Kabul, who was formerly the Minister of Tourism in Tunisia, really argues that the next great challenge for humanity is ensuring that digital learning tools actually expand opportunity rather than deepen the divide. Um, and it's true, right? Technology can absolutely give us access to high quality instruction and community building, right? That is helpful to us. But we've got to have access to that technology. And I would argue, and again, I say argue not as like I'm trying to start a fight. Like that's not what's happening here. Um, but I would argue kind of for an advancement of that idea that as adults, um, access to digital tools is absolutely critical. Um, but if as children and teenagers we didn't have access to kind of like a good foundation, it doesn't matter how good our digital tools are. Um, if we don't have the ability to look through that source material and come to our own conclusion, access to the tool isn't going to do anything for us, right? Um, she talks about it being carefully designed and governed. Um, I absolutely agree with um, the careful design. That is absolutely critical. Um, and then this may be more reflective of my own headspace in the governance climate that we are living in the United States right now. I do hesitate lightly at the idea of um, really like access to these tools um, and how people are consuming and thinking about these things as something that is inherently governable, right? Um, it's obviously, at least it's obvious to me, anyway, that the government or governance is necessary, right? When I think back to my own graduate school days, I've got to see if I can find this book. Um, because there was a book that I had to read. Um, and the title of it is escaping me, but I really want to try and find it. There we go. So there was this book that I had to read called uh, The Genius of America, How the Constitution Saved Our Country and Why It Can Again. It was written by Eric Lane and Michael Orserks in 2007. So depending on your age, it's a book, but I would say that it's a relatively new book, but you might view it as something that's been out for quite a while. Um, yeah, time is relative, really. But one of the things that Lane and Orserks talk about is um, when the United States was founded, it was initially founded with, uh, and I'm gonna sound like I'm living in the Pirates of the Caribbean right now. That Disney film franchise. But they had kind of a set of guidelines for how they thought things ought to run. Um, and the founding fathers were really operating under the assumption that people were going to do the right thing and take care of their neighbors and whatnot because it was the right thing to do. Uh, so they didn't think that they needed to build a system that compelled people to pay taxes. They thought that people would just pay taxes because it was the right thing to do. That's not what happened. Which is why 13 years after the United States gained independence um, from the British Empire, we came back around to write the Constitution. Um, and so, right, like, I share that example to say that governance is on some level necessary, um, essentially to compel people to do things that are for the good of society. Just kind of depressing, but there we are. Um, but we can also see that governance has to be thoughtful and embrace a diversity of views to be effective in helping people Um, Now, a question that I asked within the module that I'm going to post here also is, wait, how do we preserve the spirit of Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in a world um, that is increasingly mediated by technology? Um, Now, I would say that if we continue to accept that education is a fundamental human right, which is certainly, obviously, something that I accept, it also means that access to the means of that formal education is also a human right. And so, as we're kind of imagining what classrooms are going to look like and feel like in the future, we it really is critical that um, the bodies that govern us uh, really kind of hold on to that spirit of inclusion. And now I'm in a moment here where I'm feeling real cynical. You may be also. Um, but we really are here in a time where we have a good amount of power, right? Whether that be through voting or through, uh, right, just, right, again, like with literary liberations, talking about different forms of mutual aid to support one another. There's a lot of power that we have between us to build something that is helpful and, dare I say, incredible for us to move into a world that is more like the one that we want to see rather than the one that we are currently in. Um, I think this one was a little bit different, wasn't it, from ones in a weeks past. I've really been struggling with enunciating today, like more than normal. So my apologies. But um I felt like it was really important to talk about education in more of a holistic human way than to really drill down into the feminist theory of it. Um so I hope that you found this format to be helpful and enjoyable and that you got a lot out of it. Um Now we will be back next week with something that is a little bit more typical to what you come to expect over the course of this semester. And we'll be talking about gender and work. And that's going to kind of, in a way, go hand in hand with the module that we did a few weeks back on parenting. So they may feel somewhat similar to each other. But hopefully will kind of help us to broaden the conversation rather than to kind of just feel like a repeat of parenting in feminism. So I hope that you have a great week, and I will see you the same time next Wednesday. I hope you have a great week. Bye.